My name is Charles Godfrey and I'm Director of the Oxford Martin School, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the 4th James Martin Memorial Lecture. James Martin was a computer scientist and innovator who wrote broadly and influentially about the challenges of the 21st century. He was an undergraduate at Keble, and with enormous generosity made a major gift to the university that endowed the Oxford Martin School. At Martin School, we invest in research that cuts across disciplines to tackle a wide range of issues, including climate change, disease, inequality, and many other things. We support novel, high-risk, and multidisciplinary projects, especially those that do not fit within conventional funding channels. I'm delighted to say that Jim's widow, Lillian, and her daughter, Jaron, are in the audience with us today. It's with enormous pleasure that I introduce Christiana Figueres to give the James Martin Memorial Lecture today. Christiana is one of the most influential people in the world trying to engineer a concerted global response to the challenge of climate change. Christiana was born in Costa Rica, and after degrees in social anthropology at Swarthmore and the LSE in the UK, she became a diplomat, going on to lead the Costa Rica delegation to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She then joined the UNFCCC, and from 2010 to 2016 was Executive Secretary. And it was during her tenure that the historic Paris Agreement was reached in December 2015. And the success of that meeting was in large part due to Christiana's efforts, in particular bringing together both national and subnational organizations, the private sector, and civil society organizations. After stepping down from the UNFCCC, she became the convener of Mission 2020, a global initiative to drive urgent action to reach a turning point in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. And it has a particular focus on limiting the effects of climate change to the most vulnerable people and countries. I'm delighted to say that Christiana already has an association with the Oxford Martin School. She sits on the Rockefeller Commission on the Economics of Planetary Health, for which we provide the Secretariat. I'm going to finish my introduction by quoting from Christiana, because she brings a wonderfully fiery sense of can-do to her activism. And the quote is, "The coming years are a generational chance to make a positive impact. We must seize that chance with a deep sense of the huge privilege that it is to be alive today." And I love this phrase, "and a fierce, stubborn optimism." The title of Christiana's lectures today, which is being filmed and webcast, is "What Now? Next Steps on Climate Change." Join me in welcoming Christiana to the stage.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, I think already. Sir Charles, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm always quite amused when someone introduces me as a diplomat, because I never aspired to be a diplomat, certainly never aspired to be diplomatic. In particular, now that I have left the United Nations, I am anything but diplomatic, because I find sometimes it just gets in the way of saying and doing the things that need to be done. But thank you anyway for giving me the benefit of the doubt. I appreciate that. I promise not to aspire to it, however. And what a delight it is here to deliver a James Martin lecture. Thank you very much to the family who is here, traveling all the way from New York for this, and other wonderful things here that bring you back to the roots of Jim Martin. Thank you very much to both of you. And what a fantastic tradition that all of you who are at the Oxford Martin School, what a wonderful tradition you are walking in with someone to whom we owe not only more textbooks than any human being has ever written, but I don't think it's the volume that he gave us, but rather the depth of the understanding of what it is to be alive in the 21st century, and in particular his book on the meaning of the 21st century, which to me holds two very, very simple and yet profound lessons. Number one, all our mega problems are interlinked. That's why the Oxford Martin School is interdisciplinary, because he understood that all the mega problems that we are facing now and will continue to face in the 21st century, they're all interlinked. And if we find reason to progress in one, that progress helps progress in the others. So all mega problems are interlinked and all mega solutions are interlinked. And that takes me to my second conclusion and lesson from Jim Martin, which is this is solvable. This is solvable. It doesn't matter what global problem or not global problem you're looking at, it is not the problem that determines whether there's a solution. It's our attitude. That is what determines whether we can all together find a solution or not. So two very, very profound lessons that guide, or let me say, guardrail, is that a word in English? Yes. Guardrail the thoughts that I would like to share with you today. You know, we stand at a pretty critical crossroads right now at the beginning of the 21st century. We stand at a crossroads in human history where we are collectively, sometimes unconsciously, I hope increasingly consciously, deciding which way we're going to go in the 21st century. Are we going to take a path of damage and destruction, or are we going to take a path of opportunity, economic growth, and social well-being? A very, very critical decision that we're actually making, and we're making it every day through many small decisions that we're taking. What is fascinating to me when I step back from the day-to-day, what is fascinating to me is that as I see that more or less, sorry for the young people that are there, but more or less, the oldies are sitting here with a few exceptions to the young people sitting here, and the younger people are sitting up there, okay? Fascinating because this decision that we are taking right now is actually bookended by our two generations. What do I mean by that? My generation, certainly with respect to climate change, but with respect to many other things as well, is the first generation to actually understand that climate change is occurring. We inherited it from past generations, fine, they didn't understand. But the responsibility and the contribution that we have made to the history of humankind is that we have understood and developed the science. That is to be credited to this generation that is currently more or less at my age. The IPCC report of just 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, being the latest fantastic example of that. So we have developed, for the first time, because we certainly did not have it before, we have developed this scientific understanding of what it is that we are looking at. We are also, I'm going to take a little more credit for my generation, we're also beginning to develop the technologies to answer this. Beginning. Fear not, you still have a lot to do on that one. But we're beginning to develop those technologies, and I will walk you through a couple of those. We also are beginning, but only beginning, to move the capital that exists, that has been accumulating since 2008, toward the green economy. Beginning. You will have to continue. And together with all of those, we are beginning to chart a different course that is actually going to address that challenge. Beginning being the operative word in that sentence, because we will not finish the task. Now, that is the contribution of my generation. Now, to the youngsters in the room, we bookend this crossroads on one side, and you bookend it on the other side. Because you are the first generation that is going to feel the full impact of climate change. My generation will no longer feel the full impact. We have had a taste. Sadly, every week, every month, we get more and more of a taste, but we have not experienced the full impact of climate change. You will witness the full impact of climate change. And how much impact you're going to witness is being determined now. That is why we are at a moment in history that has never been as important or as profoundly influential or determining of the quality of life over the next 100 years. Now, we're actually moving in the right direction, because let's just remember that a very short 5 years ago, the science was all over the place about how we were headed for a 4, 5 degrees, some people even predicted 6-degree temperature increase, and we were. Then, 3 years ago, governments of the world adopted the Paris Agreement. In the Paris Agreement, governments commit to something that they have not achieved yet, but they do commit to keeping the maximum increase in temperature to somewhere between 1.5 and well below 2 degrees. So definitely much better than where we were without the Paris Agreement, heading for 4, 5, or 6 degrees centigrade. If, of course, if and only if the Paris Agreement is actually implemented in a timely fashion. Now, when we adopted the Paris Agreement just 3 short years ago, we actually thought, and to the climate scientists in the room, please don't listen to this because you'll have a fit, but we thought that we had some leeway. I thought that we had some leeway in the way in which we were addressing climate change, because 1.5 to well below 2, which is the text from Paris, well, maybe we shouldn't, maybe we have that flexibility, maybe we shouldn't panic about that. Well, little did we know that the IPCC would come 3 years later, mandated by the Paris Agreement, and say, you are dead wrong. You are dead wrong. The difference in half a degree between 1.5 and 2 is absolutely critical. In fact, half a degree makes a world of difference. Literally a world of difference. Because that half a degree, if we go from 1.5 to 2, that half a degree means 2 times as much loss of biodiversity, 2 times as much destruction of infrastructure and economic destruction and devaluation, and 2 to 3 times as many people exposed to life-threatening heat conditions. So if we understand that, and I'm sure all of you have read the 300 pages of the IPCC report or have it under your pillow, but I've just given you a very quick summary of that. If we understand that that is what that IPCC report, IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in this case written by 80 climate scientists, one here, thank you very much. The executive summary of that is that half a degree makes a world of difference. The other version of the executive summary is that there is no way that we can morally allow this world to go to 2 degrees. There's no way. Because if we do, we have knowingly caused that destruction and those lives. Knowingly. Because we already know it. No one can claim, I didn't know. No, we know it. So if we continue along that path, we have knowingly caused that much damage, that much suffering. Conclusion, there is only one ceiling temperature toward which we can now move. So, given that that is the challenge that we have, where are we? Well, I would argue that it's not really very easy to tell where we are on our climate change efforts, on addressing climate change, because there are many opinions out there. There are those that are saying nothing is being done. There are others that are saying something is being done. And I understand that it's very, very difficult to have one opinion, because we have right now a fascinating, what I call bifurcated reality. And some people pay more attention to one of the realities, Other people pay more attention to the other reality. One reality is the reality of the international political conversation, being championed currently by what I call the dark house. Because the White House has lost all the lights, there are no lights shining in there, and we currently have a dark house that would frankly find it very hard to believe in gravity or in the fact that the earth is round. And so when you have that kind of an attitude, well, then we understand the consequences in policy that that dark house is undertaking. Sadly, becoming a little bit contagious in Australia and Brazil. So many people point to that and say, you see, that's really what is going on. Now, that is a reality. Unfortunately, it takes up 96% of all of the news coverage in the world. That's pretty sad too. But that is a reality. It is not the only reality, even if it takes up 96% of the news coverage. The other reality that I would like us to focus a little bit more on, because it doesn't get the coverage that it needs, is the reality of what I call the real economy. And here's the thing. My boss, the atmosphere, she doesn't care what people say. She cares about what people do. She only looks at how many tons are you sending up to me. That's all she cares about. She doesn't really care about political speeches, no. She wants to know, what are you sending up? So what is the real economy doing? Well, I would like to share with you that we're actually on a very, very interesting, what I would call exponential curve of solutions on some, but not all, of the sectors that can contribute to addressing climate change. First, my favorite, coal. Totally my favorite. Why is it my favorite? Because it's so easy to figure out which sector is the one that has most responsibility here. It is coal, by far. Because it's the most carbon intensive, because we've been using it for 100 years, irresponsibly, without knowing it. And it is my favorite because we're witnessing the demise of coal. Now, for those young people, you don't know how momentous that is, but for those of us who remember what coal did for the world in the last century, it's actually pretty amazing that we're seeing the demise of coal. And we're seeing the demise for two reasons. Not necessarily, or also because of the global implications, but much more because of the local implications, because of the local health implications that are actually making coal lose its social license, as well as its economic license. So because it's already competitive, or rather because renewables are already competitive with coal, now you're beginning to see accelerated retirement of coal plants, such as in Europe. Spain being the last one, just 2 days ago, they said, close all the coal plants. Fantastic and very brave decision on the part of the government of Spain, but not the only one. A total phase out of coal, such as in Chile, in South America, a decline in the construction of new plants, such as in China and India. Yes, they're building some, but they are also actually refusing to continue and finalize the construction of many coal plants that are close to cities because of the health effects. And we're seeing canceling coal mines in no other than in Australia. So pretty amazing when you begin to see this data and put it all together, you begin to understand, oh, that's pretty interesting. And what is behind that? Well, number one, insurance companies now are refusing to give premiums or sell even any insurance policies to coal plants and coal mines because they know that asset value is actually falling very, very quickly. So if you don't have the insurance, how the heck are you going to operate anything? So no insurances anymore, by and large. No more funding. The World Bank was the first one that started saying we're not going to fund any more coal. Then it was followed by the other development banks, and now by many commercial and private banks that are saying we're not funding and financing any more coal. Just too risky. Too risky. None of them are doing it, please, to save the planet. Okay? None of them. I wish they were, but they're not. They're doing it for an even more important and powerful reason. They're doing it because the asset value is high risk now. And they understand that they don't want to throw good money after bad. So that's a very powerful reason. Now, of course, you're going to argue, well, yeah, but China's still putting in coal, and India, yes, of course. This is a transition. Let's call it a head and tail phenomenon. The fat head of coal is actually gone. There is going to be a long tail still, with some coal still in the system, but it is a tail, and it is a diminishing tail. So good news on coal. It doesn't mean that every battle is won. It means that we're moving in the right direction with coal. Oil, the next carbon-intensive fuel. Where are we on oil? Well, all of you know, certainly in this country, that we're actually electrifying transport, and what that means is less demand for oil. So we're seeing actually a very, very fast, in fact, the change in the demand for oil is happening much quicker than even the change in coal. Point. In 2013, the company Tesla, that all of you will have heard of, was founded in 2013, okay? In 2017, 4 years later, Tesla market value overtook General Motors, a company that was 110 years old. In 4 years. Now, of course, Tesla has gone through ups and downs, and you will see their share value is going up and down. Here's the point, however. As soon as Tesla took over General Motors, because making the point that this is the technology of transportation into the future, it is electric transportation that we're moving toward, then guess what happened in the next 6 months after that? 6 months after that, you had Volvo, Jaguar Land Rover, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, of course, what were they going to do? General Motors, Ford, Fiat, all the major car companies go out and go, oh, excuse me, yeah, Tesla is being really good. Okay, we're also going electric. They had all been doing this for years. They had been doing their research into electric transport, but they had never said anything, right? Because the transition is very difficult for them. But as soon as Tesla went boom onto the market, they said, okay, we want a piece of that market too. And now they're all moving over toward electric. Not only are companies all moving over to electric over the next 5 to 10 years. Sorry, Volvo moving over next year. No more internal combustion engines coming from Volvo as of next year. And the others moving over the next 5 to 10 years. But it's not just the companies. It's actually regulation that is also moving forward. So you have countries like France, Norway, the UK, Scotland, that now takes decisions separately from the UK, the Netherlands, all of these countries saying, right, we're going to put a date, right? And they have all set a date, which is within 10 to 15 years, after which no more sales of any vehicle that has the internal combustion engine. Fantastic revolution right in front of our eyes. And now, don't think this is only the developed world. India and China, the two largest developing countries. India has already set a date for when they will no longer allow the sale of the internal combustion engine, and that, my friends, is 2030. Amazing, right? Amazing. The largest democracy in the world switching over to electric transport in just 12 years. And China, because India's little upstart got there before we did, well, they're now figuring out what date are they going to set to prohibit the sale of the internal combustion engine. Let's say demand of oil is actually diminishing in front of our eyes. And of course, you also have cities. 20 of the largest cities in the world are already banning diesel. They will soon ban the internal combustion engine. And they're already banning, in fact, cars at all in the center of their cities. So we're moving toward cleaner cities with much less air pollution, and we're beginning to see the reverse of what we thought. We thought the demand of oil would be always on the up and up, constant increase of the demand on oil. Not so. We're beginning to see the decrease in the demand for oil. So is that a fat head, long tail? Yes, but I would say the fat head is still pretty fat on oil because you can see all the cars that are still there. But we're getting there. We're getting on to an exponential curve that is actually going to move quite quickly. And on renewables, same story, okay? Just 10 years ago, 4% of the electricity in the world was renewable energy, and you kind of thought about solar energy? Are you serious? What are you smoking? Renewable, solar energy? Well, now we have 12% of all the electricity in the world is already renewables. We are duplicating the capacity of renewables on the world electric grid every 4 years, duplicating every 4 years. The cost of certainly of solar has decreased 85% in the past 8 years, and we're in a continuous descent of the cost of solar. In fact, solar energy has never been as expensive as it is right now, because it is only going down. We're already at under 3 cents kilowatt hour in India, Peru, Mexico, UAE, Emirates, Morocco, Chile, and China. All of those countries are already producing solar energy at under 3 cents a kilowatt hour, killing the economics of coal. Fascinating, right? Fascinating. What that actually means is that China has already been able to not just meet the targets that they put into the Paris Agreement for how much solar they were going to produce, they've actually already exceeded it. And the target was for 2020. 2018. They've already exceeded it. India has already said, you know, in the Paris Agreement, we said we were going to be at 40% renewable energy by 2030. Pfft, peanuts, we can do much better than that. We're going to 60%, and not by 2030, but by 2027. So you see that we are facing now an exponential curve in the solution space where we're still at the bottom of that curve, but we're beginning to see the acceleration of that curve. And we will continue to see that. Yes, absolutely, if you want to argue to me that there's a legacy of coal and gas in the electric grids, yes. I don't deny that. I actually also read the literature. I can also see what is happening. But where are we going into the future? What is our intentional direction? The fact is that if we only continue what we're doing right now, all the incremental electricity, sorry, can I say that again? All the incremental electricity that is going to come onto the grid is going to be from renewables by 2021. Check that one out. Okay? And if we continue on that one, we will have 50% of all the electricity produced in the world, 50% of it is going to be from renewables, i.e. completely clean, by the year 2030. 5 years ago, would you have believed that? 2 years ago, would you have believed that? We're on an exponential curve, and we are proving Jim Martin right. Again, right? Because he said all the mega problems are solvable. We are beginning to solve this. It doesn't mean that we have, but we're beginning to address it. And he said they're interlinked. Now think about it. If we get rid of coal, if we get rid of oil, and we substitute renewables and all of the new clean technologies, yes, we're addressing climate change, but we're also cleaning the air. 7 million people today dying from air pollution in the year 2018. What is wrong with that? 7 million people dying from air pollution because of the burning of fossil fuel, mainly, a couple of other reasons too, but mainly fossil fuels. So by doing this, by bringing in the new economy of the 21st century, we're, yes, tackling climate change, we're tackling air pollution, we're improving health, we're improving transportation, because we're not just going to move toward electrified transportation, we're moving toward shared and driverless, which is going to be much more efficient. We can talk about it later. And we're making cities much more livable. And 70% of all the people in the world are going to be living in cities very soon. So we want to make the quality of life in cities much better than it is today. Fascinating change that we're in, right? Exponential change, driven by what? Driven, as we have heard, by technology development, driven by price decrease, driven by policy frameworks, the countries and the cities that are doing that, certainly driven by finance that is beginning to put their money where there is less risk, which is in the green economy, and hold on to your horses, because that has still not benefited from the two most powerful accelerators that everybody sitting up there in the top row is very familiar with, and which is a total mystery to the rest of us: digitalization and artificial intelligence. Once you overlay technology, price decrease, policy, and finance, and you overlay that with artificial intelligence based on digitalization, there is no stopping the transformation that we're going to see in this century. Now, that's the good news. The problem is that we're not yet seeing that advance in everything to do with land use, reforestation, degradation of forest, or restoration of degraded lands, protection of standing forests. Well, that whole family is not yet on the exponential curve of solutions. Neither is heavy industry. So we're not seeing that kind of accelerated solution with steel, cement, all of those heavy industries, iron, that require a lot of electricity in order to bring a product to the market. That is why it's very important that the Energy Transition Commission actually is doing a study to figure out how are we going to decarbonize all of those sectors, and their conclusion that they will be publishing very soon is, just like Jim Martin said, we can actually create the world that we want. We can decarbonize those sectors. It is technically doable. It is financially viable. It's a question of deciding that we're going to do it. And in fact, my friends, what we have to remember is that decarbonization is the growth story of the 21st century. It is what all of you have to look forward to most. We're going to be creating $26 trillion in new economic growth because of decarbonization. We're going to be creating 65 million new jobs. To all of you who are worried, well, I guess if you go to Oxford, you're not worried that a computer is going to take your job, but to your friends who are not at Oxford and who are concerned that a computer may be taking, or a robot may be taking away your jobs, tell them this: 65 million new jobs being created around the world because of the decarbonization of the economy. All of it, very good news. Now, it's not easy. I'm not going to stand up here and go, well, you know, we can all go to sleep because tomorrow we're going to wake up in a decarbonized economy. No, it's not easy. We need to do a whole bunch of stuff. It has to be a smooth but sharp descent, as the IPCC report has reminded us. It does require full-on, all technologies. It requires all sectors. It requires all geographies. It requires both systemic changes and behavioral changes. We can talk about behavioral changes. It requires investment of at least $1 trillion a year, and certainly it requires policy to move much faster than it is. But all of this is doable. It is doable. It is a question of taking the decision that we're actually, to quote Jim Martin one more time, we can create the world that we want. We have to pursue that, and we have to do it intentionally. So, let me conclude by answering the question, so what the heck does that have to do with me personally, okay? Do I have anything to do in this? Well, I would argue yes. First, because it is your future and the future of 7 generations after you. And I would say there are at least 3 elements that I would suggest you keep in mind. No matter what profession you have chosen or will choose, no matter what geography you will be working in, no matter what level of the system you choose to work in, whether you choose to work at the local, at the city, at the state, at the global, doesn't matter. 3 components that I would wish for you to remember. Number 1, passionate engagement. If you are going to go out there and tackle your quote-unquote job from 9 to 5, and then go home at 5 and completely forget about it, I'm sorry, you are abdicating responsibility. And furthermore, you're not going to have fun. We all want to have fun. I want to have fun at home and at work. And if you're not passionately engaged with what you're working in, you're not going to make a difference. And I cannot believe that there is a brain in this hall that doesn't want to make some kind of a difference. You have to define where you want to do that and what difference you're going to make. But if you do not engage with that passionately, you're not going to make any difference. So passionate engagement and active participation with whatever you choose to do. Secondly, something that my generation is really bad at, Radical collaboration. My generation is so good at silo thinking because, somehow we got into this specialization and, you're either this kind of a professional or that and that. And good heavens, doesn't this professional should certainly not talk to that professional. Good heavens. They might have cooties. No. Honestly, radical collaboration. This is not, as Jim Martin told us, we're not going to be able to make this transformation if we stay in our particular silos. The James Martin School is interdisciplinary because we have to get the interdisciplinary chip into our head. That's how we have to function. It's not just while we're going to school and how fun. No, that's the chip that we have to get into our heads. This is about radical collaboration. This is about radical collaboration across the professions, across the sectors, across the geographies, across the social levels, across everything. Do not accept any artificial boundary that limits your collaboration. Everyone can learn from everyone else. And 1 and 1 in collaboration is always 3. It's never 2. And finally, my total favorite, stubborn optimism. So, what do I mean by stubborn optimism? Well, first, what do I mean by optimism? By optimism, I don't mean celebrating when you've had a success, because frankly, that is very boring. I mean, everybody can do that, right? What's the big deal? You have a success, you celebrate, okay, fine. Yes, you should celebrate, but how is that a contribution to the world? I don't mean optimism as the result of success or as an achievement. I mean optimism as the input to a challenge. That's different. I mean optimism which is knowing that impossible is not a fact, it's only an attitude, and that we can be optimistic because we can create the world that we want. And if you don't have a vision of what world you want for yourselves and for your kids and for 7 generations down, you better go home and figure out what your vision is, because you can't work effectively without having a vision and without having absolutely unswerving optimism that, yes, together we're actually going to get there. But it also has to be stubborn. And what I mean by stubborn is what some people would call persevering or relentless, but I think those words are boring. My point is that as we have a vision, and you can tell what my vision of society is, right? As we have a vision, we know that we're going to get all kinds of barriers and problems and challenges thrown in our face every 5 minutes. That we already know. That's not news. Do not be surprised, okay? Oh, I have a challenge, I have a barrier. No, don't be surprised about that, because that's already part of the system. We know that we're going to encounter that. The trick is, what do you do about that? Do you then fold your hands and go, okay, well, in that case, we can't do anything? Or do you say, wow, fantastic. This challenge I've never seen before. Now let's figure out how we're going to get over this one. Are we going to go above? Are we going to below? To the left? To the right? What are we going to do? And do it together. That's what I call stubborn optimism. And you know what? I don't think there's any other way to live in the 21st century. And something tells me that if you have any relationship to Jim Martin, any relationship, whatever, not just blood relationship, but any philosophical, ideological relationship to Jim Martin, that you're all stubborn optimists already. So I firmly welcome you into a growing family of stubborn optimists around the world.
Christiana, that was absolutely fabulous. Really inspiring.
What do you think Jim Martin would have said? That's the real question.
Well, I think he would have said something very similar.
All right.
So thank you for the stubborn optimism, and thank you for being not too diplomatic in what you said. So we have the opportunity now for questions. I should remind you that it will be recorded and the questions will go out on the webcast. There are roving microphones, so if you could put your...
So don't ask anything that you want to be known for, right?
Exactly.
Got it.
If you could just wait till the microphone gets to you, otherwise it won't appear on the webcast. And we have microphones both in the galleries and on the floor. Let me go to Natalie here in the front row for the first question. And do wave your arms to make certain that I can see you, especially if you're not in my... And if you could say your name first, Natalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie Seddon, Professor of Biodiversity in the Department of Zoology here. Thank you for that incredibly inspiring and motivating talk. You said that nature-based solutions to the causes and consequences of climate change are not yet on that exponential curve. What's it going to take to get them there?
What a good question, Natalie. You know, honestly, that is one of the questions that keeps me up at night, right? So I don't think there's one answer to that. I think there's several components. First, that sector is deploringly undercapitalized. And it is undercapitalized because we have not figured out what the business model is that is actually going to make it work. We figured out the business model of renewable energy. We're figuring out the business model of electrifying transportation. We have definitely not figured out the business model of this. And I know for sure, I wish this were not true, but I know for sure that we are not going to deal with nature-based solutions as a charity object. If it's only about charity, it's not going to get done. It's just not going to get done. So right now, it's sort of in that space, right? Because we know that it is morally correct, and it is getting, let's say, public funding, and it is getting philanthropical funding, but we haven't moved it over to where the market forces are just going to accelerate it. So I think the business model needs to be thought of, and once we get the business model, then we will have the capital. Problem, of course, one of the problems why the business model is so difficult is because it is unbelievably distributed. You know, you can generate energy out of certain point sources around the world. You don't necessarily have to go to millions and millions and millions of small farmers around the world and change what they've been doing for 100 years. So that, I think, is, you know, part of that's the granular, the sand in that wheel that is not allowing us to get to a business model. Which only means, in my book, that is exactly what we should be figuring out, right? If we say, okay, well, in that case, we're not going to solve it. Unacceptable, right? That is what we should be figuring out.
Thank you. Another question. Gentleman in a black pullover, waving his hands.
Hello. Yeah, my name's Anthony Melville. I'd just like to ask, so how do we deal with deforestation and destructive agriculture, including biofuels?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question that Natalie just asked also, right? Because that's the whole family. It's deforestation, it is restoration of degraded lands, it's protection of standing forests. That whole family of issues is just not where it needs to be. And until we can figure out a business model, and I tell you, I come from a tiny, weensy little country, but in Costa Rica, we actually did figure out this business model. It just hasn't been taken to scale. Because in Costa Rica, we have something that is called payment for environmental services. And so way cool. We have a tax on what you call petrol, that we call gasoline. We have a tax on petrol that we then gather and pay landowners to either reforest or keep the forest if they have forest, okay? That is payment for environmental services. What are they getting paid for? They're not getting paid for the wood. They're getting paid for the environmental service of carbon capture, CO2 being captured. They're being paid for the environmental service of the aquifers that are being protected. And they're actually even getting paid for landscape beauty. Now, when you get the payment of that service, then if I am a landowner or if I am a lone standing mother with 2 children and I have to put food on a table tomorrow, and I have the temptation to cut this tree because it's going to give food for my children, I will cut that tree. If you come and tell me, you know what, don't cut the tree, I'm going to pay you to keep that tree. Now I can keep the tree, right? So if we had payment for environmental services as a business model around the world at scale, we would have a completely different result. Result in Costa Rica? Costa Rica is the only country in the world that has actually increased its forest cover over the past 20 years. Increased its forest cover. Everybody else is decreasing. We're increasing it because we're paying people to do so. Where do we get the money? By taxing fossil fuels. Pretty cool.
The gentleman in the second row of the circle there. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris Church, Oxfordshire Climate Action Network. You talk about the majority of the population living in cities. We're in a progressive city here, but dependent for a lot of our services on a county where the administration is about to make 900 jobs redundant, where we are desperately short of services and we're stuck with a very economically conservative growth model. They had a climate change target set 10 years ago, which they've largely done nothing on. If you had 5 minutes to talk to the leaders of our councils, what would your priorities be for local government in the UK at this time?
I think that's the wrong question. I think the question, I would like to return the question to you. You live here. You're concerned about what's happening here. You understand the complexity of the issues here, which I do not. I would like to ask you, because you know what the right thing is to do, and because you know what future generations will be expecting from you, what are you willing to do to go and have that conversation, not on your own, but building alliances to actually go and have that conversation? The reason why I'm turning the question to you is because I think we have to realize that this is not easy. I have made it sound easy, right? It is not. This is a battle that is being won county by county, city by city, town by town, and it's won by people who are as concerned as you are and who are willing to put their brain, their intelligence, their brilliance, their time, their effort into building alliances to actually move forward. It takes everyone to do this. You cannot proceed on confrontation. The Paris Agreement is the best example that confronting is not going to take us anywhere. You always have to find where is there space, where is there common ground for us to actually agree on something that does move us forward. We will never have the perfect solution immediately, but there is always space to find common ground to move one step in the right direction. And that is what we're all called to do. Find one little bit of common ground with anyone. In your case, it's the county, but it could be anybody else. There's always the possibility to find one step that can be done that everybody can agree to. And that is both the art and the science of actually moving forward into progress.
Thank you. Miles Allen at the front here.
Miles Allen, Oxford Martin School, and one of the authors on the 1.5 report. And you talked about finding common ground, and you started your talk talking about the sort of intergenerational issues involved in climate change. If I might invite you to be undiplomatic again, what do you think we should do about the fact that the world's most profitable industry is expecting the next generation of taxpayers to clean up its mess? More specifically, every year we fail to start reducing emissions, there's another 40 billion tons of CO2 that will have to be scrubbed out of the atmosphere in the second half of this century if we're to actually meet the 1.5 degree goal. At the moment, the only scenario is that'll be paid for by the next generation. How do we engage the expertise, the access to capital, and the extraordinary resources of the world's fossil fuel industry in actually addressing that challenge of getting rid of their waste rather than just leaving it for the next generation to clean up?
Yeah, honestly, that's like the Gordian knot, right? That's the Gordian knot. Now, first, let me say, I don't think it's helpful to lump all the fossil fuels together, just because I think, A, they have different historical responsibility, A. B, They definitely have a very different lifetime. So coal, in my book, has lifetime 0. Our tolerance for coal has just got to be wiped off the table. Right? There is no fuel that is as damaging to the lungs of our children than coal. So, excuse me, not just to the lungs of the children, to the lungs of the coal miners. Let's look at, black lungs. So coal, I have no, and that's part of my diplomatic speech, I have no patience for coal whatsoever anymore. Particularly not after your report. But I had a little patience before, but now 0. Oil, I think, has somewhat of a lifespan, but interestingly enough, the oil and gas companies are beginning, there's never anything perfect in the world, the progressive enlightened companies that produce both gas and oil, that are different from those that produce coal, are beginning to understand that oil has got to be brought under or in second importance to gas. And they're beginning to conceive of themselves not as oil and gas, but as gas and oil. Illustration point, Statoil, the Norwegian oil and gas company, changed its name. They don't want to be called Statoil anymore. They're now called Equinor. Much more politically correct, right? But the interesting thing is that that change in name, which occurred just a few months ago, has actually pervaded the company into them understanding that, yes, they're now producing oil and gas as well, but that is not their long-term business model. And you see certainly the European gas and oil companies, because they're all beginning to think of themselves as that, actually beginning to figure out what is their pathway to a transition. Now, the difficult thing here is to bring shareholders on board, right? Because the moment that these gas and oil companies begin to change their business model, the shareholders are going to go, whoa, 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 whoa. That's not what, we signed up for. We signed up for a company that continues to invest in new exploration and new fields because there's a 5% depletion in the resource that is constant. And so you have to constantly shore up that. So it's a very difficult conversation with shareholders. But they're beginning to have those conversations. And the fact is that the five European gas and oil companies, because they hate it every time I call them oil and gas, the gas and oil companies are really beginning to figure out what is their transition path. So you have Shell that already came out and said, we're taking full responsibility for all emissions, not just from our products, but your use of my products. Pretty bold on the part of Shell, and they have a commitment to being carbon neutral by the year 2070. As I have said to them, fantastic, but it has to be by 2050, because that's what the IPCC says. But they're getting there, okay? They're getting there, some of them. Very interesting that just 1 month ago, ExxonMobil and Chevron, 2 of the largest US-based companies, joined OGCI, which is the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, that is the group of companies that are actually a little bit more responsible. So even the companies in the United States are actually beginning to understand, maybe we don't want to experience the Kodak moment, right? They don't want to be caught selling the best quality photographic paper in a world that has gone digital. Who the heck is going to buy photographic paper? They're beginning to understand that. They're beginning to understand that they can't, 30, 40 years from now, they can't be caught continuing to sell oil and gas because nobody's going to want it. So they're beginning to move. Are they moving fast enough? No. Are they beginning to see it? Yes.
A question from a woman just in front of Clara there.
Thank you very much. My name is Irina. Thank you for your talk. So I would love to hear your opinion on sort of the role of the individual. In your talk, you focused on the state level, and you very briefly mentioned behavioral change. So I'd love for you to sort of elaborate that, and also talk a little bit about what you think about moral reasoning rather than sort of economic incentives. Thank you.
Moral reasoning. You know, I believe in something that I call, I have no idea what it's really called, but I call it contextual messaging, which is speak to the person that you're speaking to in the terms that they will understand. So moral reasoning takes you very, very far if you are engaging, which I very often do, with spiritual and religious communities. And I'm actually going to Toronto for that purpose. And because that is what makes sense to that community. I don't go moralizing when I walk into the boardroom of Shell or Exxon because they're like, are you talking Chinese? You know, it's just, it doesn't make sense. So you always have to, morality and our moral responsibility, which I think is absolutely fundamental, makes sense to some people. So use it with those people for whom it makes sense. You're wasting your time if you use it with people with whom it doesn't make sense. Behavioral changes, 4 for each individual. Are you ready? Number 1, if you're still eating meat every day of the week, you're committing a crime. Okay? Eating meat is the easiest thing. Stop eating meat or decline your eat of meat is the easiest thing that every individual can do, particularly in this country. You can't say the same for other people in impoverished developing countries. But in the UK, if you're eating meat every day, excuse me, 0 responsibility, okay? 0 responsibility. So if you're eating meat 7 days a week, cut it down to 5. 6 months from now, cut it down to 3. Cut it down to 1, cut it down to 0. You can do it. I know you can. So be aware of what you're eating. And sorry, that's just meat, but it goes for, you know, all our, you know, fancy-dancy stuff that we imported, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, fine. So be careful about what you eat. Not be careful, be intentional about what you eat. Because everything that you put in your mouth not only has some impact on your body, which meat does not have a good impact on your body, but it also has an impact on the planet. So either you do it for your health, your personal health, or you do it for the health of the planet. Be intentional about what you eat. Number 2, transport. Now, in this country, one of the things, and I live in London, one of the things that I absolutely love about this country is the fact that we have public transport in this country, most places, certainly in London. But if in addition to having the public transport, you're still cruising around, you know, on your own, on 4 wheels that are burning some kind of fossil fuel, hello? You're committing a crime. Number 3. To those sitting down here, because the youngsters probably are not there yet, do you know where your finances are? Do you know where your pension money is? Do you know where your savings money is? If any of your pension money, your savings, your, you know, whatever, your bank account, whatever, if any of that money is invested in high carbon assets, my friends, you're also committing a crime. And number 4, voting. Oh my God, voting. We would have completely different results. Would you like to stand up and share, please do, and share what you just told me about the love vote, please, because it's so important.
Do we have a microphone here,
please? Please.
I recently signed a pledge
Stand up, because it's really important. Everybody to vote here. Go for it, go for it.
I recently had to sign a pledge in front of a number of young girls, 17 years old, that I will vote. And they all made sure I signed it, and they all texted me on election day and asked me, can we have a picture of you with your sticker? Text, text, text. Yes, I voted. It made me vote. You have to vote.
The interesting thing about this movement is the young people are not telling you how to vote, right? They're just raising your awareness about the fact that there are millions of people on this planet for whom we are determining the future, who have no voice in those elections. And so if you are privileged, A, to live in a democratic country that has voting, and B, if you're old enough to vote, and you don't go vote, you're also committing a crime. You are. I mean, we have to understand that if we do not address climate change, it is a crime against humanity. It is a crime against future generations. Because we knowingly are causing something, right? Knowingly. The IPCC has told us. So we're knowingly walking down that path. So food, transport, money, voting. 4 things that everybody can do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. What is the maximum human population you wish to see, bearing in mind that China, India, Africa, and South America will presumably increasingly expect and demand a Western lifestyle? They will drive, they will use central heating, air conditioning, and so on. In relation to this point, do you support nuclear fission?
Would you like to tell us your name?
Tom Clark.
Thank you.
Let me take the last first, because it's easier. I know for sure that nuclear is not the solution to the energy grid of the future, mainly because it is very expensive to do it safely. If you're going to go to 4th generation nuclear, that hikes up the cost pretty dramatically. And frankly, anything less safe than 4th generation is very dangerous. So to those countries that can afford 4th generation nuclear, that is their decision. But most countries cannot afford that. So I don't think that nuclear is the solution to the electric grid. On the other hand, I think under certain circumstances, if you can afford it, if the finances are there, and you want to contribute to your grid, safe 4th generation nuclear, well, those of you who can do it, go ahead and do it. To your other question that is much more complicated. I think, I come from Costa Rica, as I've already said. I come from a developing country. So I find it very difficult when I'm living in a developed country, such as this fantastic country. I find it very difficult to sit here and preach at developing countries what they ought to do or ought not to do. I find it very difficult to preach to an African mother who knows that she has to have 5 children because 4 of them will die before they're 5, and she doesn't know which 4. And she's lone standing. She maybe lives in the Sahel. Man is long gone. She's under climate change pressure, so less and less food, less and less water. And I find it very difficult to tell her, you know what, you can only have 1 child. Because she'll turn around to me and say, that child is going to die. And how am I going to live into my old age? So population growth is a very, very difficult issue for me, frankly. Because I don't think that it is something that just because those of us who are privileged enough to live in a developed country with the creature comforts and the material conditions that we have here, we can certainly control our population growth. But it's very difficult to impose that on other people who live in other conditions. So my preference is, instead of harping on population growth, my preference is to work toward resource efficiency. There is nothing that is holding us to the per capita consumption that we have right now. The per capita consumption of water, food, metals, air, everything. The per capita consumption, to begin with, is much higher in developed countries, so that's where we should start. But there's nothing to say that we have to continue to be as inefficient about the use of all of our resources as we have been in the past 100 years. And fortunately, I think all the technologies that we're developing now are actually leading toward resource efficiency. So we are actually going to be able to maintain standards of living using less energy, using less land, using less water, using less metals, because we're becoming much more efficient as a society. So me, I would rather put my brains and my time and my effort into resource efficiency and ensure that that resource efficiency is actually accessible by developing countries than force population growth controls on people who need that population in order to survive.
Thank you. Could I go to the gentleman with the white shirt up there?
Thank you so much. My name's Eli Mitchell-Larson, and I'd like to apologize because I live in a canal boat, which I still heat with coal, but hopefully that will change.
Excuse me, how much longer are you going to be doing that?
Maybe a few months. So my question, so you
Sorry,
have the...
a few months. So what does that mean? 2, 3, how many months?
I can commit to 4, let's say.
Okay, no. So this is going to be important, right? Because I like deadlines, okay? So today, what's today? October what? 29th. This is the problem when you're transparent. Okay, October 29th. So now we have November, December, January, February. So, and February has how many days? Does February next year have 28 or 29 days? Okay, we're going to give you grace. Let's say by the 1st of March of 2019, you will have eradicated coal from your life. And you know why deadlines are important? Because otherwise, we just don't have the impetus to do it. And honestly, you're going to feel, it's going to be difficult, I'm warning you, okay? But you will feel so happy that you have done that. Now, sorry, what was your question?
Thank you, okay. So my question, you operated for many years, and you still do, at sort of the highest level of international climate negotiation, which I think is something that's a bit opaque to the general populace, except for an annual press release about the COP conference and what happened. But what I'm curious about is maybe commenting on like what the day-to-day grind is, like what's happening behind the scenes that we might not be aware of throughout the year, not just at the COPs. And maybe also comment on, having spent so much time in that world, what you think is great about that process, what you think is broken about the process, and finally, sort of what the prospects are for a true global governance scheme or something that can kind of tie everybody together that's even stronger than Paris.
I see. This is your revenge for me challenging you, right? Nice revenge. Very nice revenge. So the international negotiations, well, you're quite right. You're quite right that it is not just about the COP. The COP is the conference of the parties. It's not about bad cops and good cops. It's about a meeting that is held by all governments of the world under the Climate Convention at the end of every year, it's always in a different country, in which the major decisions are taken. And that was COP21. That means up until then, we've had 21 of them. This year is the 24th. It'll occur in Poland. But what you're quite right about is that it's not just what happens during those 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks is the pinnacle of everything that has been prepared throughout the year. So although it doesn't get any press, the negotiation is a continuous negotiation throughout the 12 months. And how you start every year is you do, I'm just going to speak as though I were still at the Secretariat. It's just easier for me to get my brain there. So you take the results of the last negotiation, whichever one that was. You see the legal text, of which there are many, because you always have in Paris, we had 67 different issues being negotiated under 5 different tracks. And so you take the results of all of that, you analyze it, and you go, okay, so here's where we are now. The IPCC says this is policy that is science-driven, okay? Science-driven policy. So you take the results and you go, okay, that gives us a world of whatever, but IPCC says we have to be here. So for next year, what do we want to do? And then as a Secretariat, you decide, okay, for next year, we can't be over here because that's not how humanity works, but we can be at this place. And then you begin to mark out the boundaries of what you think is between the necessary and the possible. The necessary is always too much, the possible is always too little. So you begin to delineate what do you think is somewhere in between the necessary and the possible. Because you know, or I knew, that my responsibility was to lead countries and private sector to the next step. And once you have that idea of what is somewhere between the necessary and the possible, and everybody will always tell you, that's not possible, and the scientists will go and say, that's insufficient, and you go, well, good, if we're getting criticized by both, we probably have a good thing here. And then you start to drive it toward that, right? But it's not easy because you have 67 different issues, 5 different negotiating tracks, and 195 countries. I have no idea how that works out, but it's a pretty, what is fun about it is that it's very much like a, what are those little cube things called, the blow boxes?
Rubik Cube.
Oh, that one, yeah. It's like a Rubik Cube, right? Except it has 67 on one, 5 on the other, and 195 on the other side. And so you have to keep all of that somehow up here, and you have this mental map of it, or okay, if we move this over here, then that means that this has to go over here, so it's actually quite fun. The complexity is fun, okay? The complexity is fun, and what is truly a blessing, truly a privilege, is the opportunity and the responsibility to have very open and frank conversations with the leaders of every country and of every company. And that is what you do in preparation. So they come together and they negotiate with each other. But in addition to that, my responsibility, or at least I thought it was my responsibility, was to actually go to all countries and have true, transparent conversations about what do you want? What do you need? When you think about your generations, 3 generations down, what kind of a world do you want? And move them toward the vision that they want to develop for themselves. And then walk them back and go, okay, well, if that's what you want, then what are we going to do now? Here is the step that we're looking at. And then tracking it throughout the year. And then going 2 weeks and not eating and not sleeping until you get the results you want.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end, so I'm going to take 3 questions, and if they could be brief, and then ask Christiana to address them. So 1 here, and then hands up for...
Hi, my name is Josh. I'm a graduate student here in environmental history. I got to see you in action as an undergraduate on a journalism grant at COP21 a couple of years ago. And I wanted to follow up on that question on the second half of it, which we didn't get to quite as much. You called earlier in your talk international negotiations just one possible tool, and I wanted to dig into that possible tool since you were the executive secretary.
Quite briefly, if you
yeah,
wouldn't
sorry.
mind.
So you've highlighted some of the success stories, you've talked about the cooperative advances of COP21, but the flip side is it provided cover for reticent governments, and many of the leading governments now aren't on track to meet their own INDCs. So I'm wondering, how do we think not just... Well, are not. So I wonder, how do we think not just about the successes of COP21, but also about the failures and the lessons?
Thank you very much. And then we had a question just there, I think. Clara, where was the... Thank you.
My name's Helen Mountfield. I wanted to know where the 65 million jobs are going to come from and how we're going to make sure they're fairly distributed so people feel a stake.
Thank you. And I think there was a final one just on the balcony. There was someone trying to attract my attention.
Hi there. I'm Daniel, also a grad student in environmental management. And my question, you mentioned the dark house and the 96% of news coverage. And I mean, a lot of my family voted for Trump, and we're talking about all this movement, but I just wanted you to maybe clarify, like, is there any social movement towards like addressing it, not just from an economic scope? And like you mentioned these solutions, but I can tell you that my family members are not going to be thinking about that in the coming weeks when they're watching certain news stations. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're right. I'm trying to choose which one do I end. Well, let me just go with that. Yeah, the situation in the United States, I think, is a highly divided situation. Unfortunately, we have someone who actually thrives on division more than on collaboration, and that is even more dangerous. And so the divisions that we had before have only been magnified. That is a very, very sad situation. I think that the social damage and social network and safety guardrails that are typical of any society that have been so damaged in the past 2 years, that is the fundamental worst thing that we have seen. It's not even the climate impact. It is the social impact of the fact that all of a sudden it's okay to voice hate and to have acts of violence. I mean, that's the piece that I think is very, very difficult to redo the fabric of civility and respect. So I'm sorry for your family, honestly. I'm sorry that, that they are taken by that. And there must be a reason. And if you have the opportunity to talk to your family, I would be really interested, what is the reason, right? So don't condemn them, don't confront them, but try to understand what are they seeing in that? What is the reason? And I think that will open up some kind of a conversation for you. But jumping to what is actually being done, I actually, when he was elected, I started a thank you letter that I am writing, and I will write it over the next 4 years. And the letter starts, "Dear Mr. Trump, thank you very much for the following." Because what I see is that because he's taking such extreme positions on many issues, it's actually causing a huge wave against that. So you see it in the women's movement. You see it, you certainly see it on climate change, because you see more states and cities and corporations and towns that are coming out to say, we're going to decarbonize because it's good for our economy. Would they have been so passionate and so determined to do it without that election? I don't know. But the fact is that one extreme calls for a reaction from the other direction. So I am focusing on my gratitude. For everything that we're seeing. To your question about the jobs, here's the fun answer to that, and that is, I recently saw a statistic that 60% of the jobs that people who are today between the ages of 20 and 30, 60% of those jobs haven't even been invented yet. Isn't that cool? Right? That is so cool, because if you think about all the technologies that are coming on board, right? Everything to do with artificial intelligence, everything to do with digitalization, all of those new things, nanotechnology, all of those that Jim Martin wrote a lot about, all of those are now all of a sudden so, I don't know what word to use, fertilized, right? They're just on steroids, and you're going to see all these new jobs being created. I mean, when I ask a young person, what are you studying or reading, as you say here, and they give me a word, and I'm like, what is that? Because it's all these new things that are being invented. So it's absolutely fantastic, right? And it goes all the way from installing solar panels, which is today the largest and fastest growing job in the United States, is installers of solar panels. How cool is that? So all the way from that to all of the other stuff for which I don't even have a name, because it's so far out into the future. But that's exciting. That is so exciting, because it means we are creating the world that we want. And to your question about, I think you posed it about what are the failures of COP21. I think that's a premature question. I don't think that we are yet at the point in which we can actually decide, did we succeed or did we fail with the Paris Agreement, for the following reason. Because one of the wise characteristics of the Paris Agreement was to realize, again, thanks to the IPCC, that we had a long way to go. And human capacity to visualize where we need to go is actually rather limited. So is technology at a moment, so is finance at a moment, so is policy at a moment. So what we did was we said, okay, right, we're gonna set the goal to what science says, somewhere well below 2, and between 1.5 and well below 2. Today we know it has to be 1.5, but anyway, we set the vision, and then we inscribe into the Paris Agreement a path. And we say, right, that ultimate goal is not where we are right now. It's far from it. So the Paris Agreement is actually not static. It says every 5 years, okay, everybody go home to all the 195 countries, obviously with much more respect than this. Everybody go home, do your homework, do your consultation with all your sectors, with everybody, and come back and say and tell us, how can you contribute to this solution? It's a global solution, but everybody has to contribute individually. So everybody went home, all 195, and out of the 195, 189, some like Syria were kind of busy and didn't have time for their homework, but 189 countries came forward and said, right, this is my homework. This is how I can contribute to the solution. So those solutions, which were visible to the countries in 2014, which is when they put this in, and some in 2015, those solutions are visible and make sense for them because it is measures that are beneficial to their economy, to their transport, to their land use, to their energy efficiency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they put in a menu, if you will, of measures that, that make sense to them because they want to pursue them because it is within their development plans. And then we added all of that up and we said, okay, good, but it's not enough. Therefore, that we will take that as a first effort, as a first tranche, for those of you who drink wine, as the first vintage. And that's a nice vintage, thank you very much. That's a 2015 vintage. Now, 5 years from now, we will all come back. And so 5 years from now, from then, is now 2020. So all of that first vintage has actually been moving forward. And now the countries need to come together again in 2020, and they're beginning to do that homework to figure out how much of what we said in 2014-15 has actually been accomplished, what other technologies are available to us, what policies have we put in place, what finance, and how much more can we do. So the Paris Agreement is actually already foreseen as being not a static, but actually as a decade-long effort in which every 5 years we have the moment that we call the ratchet mechanism, which is ratcheting up ambition, and that is what is coming now. Some countries are not yet being able to do what they said they were going to do. But the large countries are over-complying. China is totally over-complied. India, totally over-complied. The United States, the jury is out. Honestly, I hear people that saying, actually, despite the dark house, the United States, because of whatever the rest of the economy is doing, they're actually going to be able to comply with Paris. Some people are saying, no way. I don't know. We have to wait and see. Europe, over-complied. So, over-complied already. So, yes, there are some, actually, all the little islands, all the Pacific islands, over-complied. Countries in South America, some of them, over-complied. Many countries in Africa, under-complied. Okay, the point is, however, that there is a direction to this, and that they will have the opportunity and the responsibility in 2020, starting 2019 next year, to go back and do their homework again. And they have a certain periodicity to actually improve their efforts. Now, because this is the last, right? Could I borrow this for a second? To finish your question. The danger with that, and you can understand how that was the only way that we could construct a global framework where every single country was on board and that was responsive to science. There was actually no other way to square that circle. The danger with that is that in the final analysis, if we don't have enough emission reductions and nature-based solutions, we may overshoot. And then we're going to be into the situation where we actually have to have many negative emissions, i.e., hopefully biological capture and storage, which is reforestation, or geological capture and storage that is not commercial yet, and that is not available at scale. But what does this, independently of how we get there, here is what science is telling us, and this is the scary thing. Science is telling us, right now we have about 41 gigatons of CO2 that we are shooting up into the air per year globally. Let's call it 40 just for simplicity. So let this piece of paper be 40 gigatons. And what science is telling us is, you know what? Starting in 2020, we have to begin to half this. Not H-A-V-E, no, H-A-L-F. Half the emissions. So that by 2030, we have half of what we have today. And we would have then 20 gigatons. By 2040, we have to have half that amount again. So now we're down to, what's half of 20, even in Oxford? 10? Oh, thank you. 10? Thank you. Okay, we're down to 10, right, by 2040. By 2050, half again. Now we're down to 5 gigatons, okay, by 2050. 5 gigatons is the maximum that we think can be naturally absorbed by the planet. Do you see that the pace of emission reductions is something that the world has never done, has never seen, has never attempted? Do you also see that the pace of emissions is what is going to determine the quality of life on this planet? So just because this is challenging doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just means it's a little more difficult. Hence, we need all the brains in this hall and outside. Thank you.
So, Christiana, I take 3 things from your wonderful presentation this lunchtime.
Should I take out a pencil?
First of all, your passion, your logic, and your can-do attitude. I can completely understand now why you were so successful as the head of the UNFCCC, and I think that's the message for all of us as we interact with policymakers in this country and abroad. Secondly, I think it's a wonderful message for the university in general, and especially for the Oxford Martin School, because you have so reminded us of Jim Martin's vision and what we have to do, interdisciplinarity, getting away from silos. And then finally, the message you've given to all of us as individuals, even those of us who don't live on coal-burning barges, that, and we will have your name on the way out.
Oh, no, I'm so sorry.
That there is a huge amount we can just do as individuals. So can I ask everyone to join me again in thanking Christiana for just a fabulous talk?